Peter Baker, FBI checks are a critical factor. Senators are saying they won't hold confirmation hearings, at least the Democrats are saying that, without an FBI background check. That would have caught the problems with Matt Gaetz, although that was pretty obvious, but also some problems with the Pentagon choice and some others. And also the ethics agreement that he has not signed, which means the transition is unaccountable in terms of who's contributing and whether there are even foreign contributors. What's going on here?
Well, what's going on here, of course, is you have a president-elect who is in battle with what he calls the deep state. And by that, he is meaning the federal government and the traditions and standards that have been used in the past. He doesn't like the FBI. He believes the FBI to be a hostile force. Remember, the FBI, of course, has been on the teams that have investigated him. And so when they say, well, gosh, we should have the FBI investigate your choices, he doesn't see that as a positive. But you're right. I mean, it's unthinkable, at least in modern times, to be filling some of these very important positions without some sort of a background check. And the senators are going to be tested to see how much they make that a red line for them. You're right that you didn't need an FBI background check to catch the issues with Matt Gaetz. Frankly, you only need a Google search with a number of these people to determine some of the issues that are out there and would have been out there had the transition team done any kind of vetting. But that's not the priority for them. Trump doesn't care in some ways whether you find scandals or allegations of wrongdoing. It does seem like a rather different standard to say not prosecuted counts as a good enough standard for a cabinet job. But for Trump, the main thing is loyalty. And if you're loyal to him, you're part of his team, you're going to execute his agenda, then the rest of the stuff is all just noise as far as he's concerned. He's been charged and accused of so many things. It doesn't bother him when the people that he's going to pick are accused or charged with things too, because he doesn't take much of that seriously. He puts it all in the category of witch hunting and persecutions.
And Ashley Parker, pull back the curtain, as you did in the Washington Post today, on what's going on with Trump advisor Boris Epshteyn. He's been involved in a lot of this infighting with Susie Wiles, as a matter of fact, having to play traffic cop. Talk us about your reporting.
He sure has. And we did a story sort of capturing how this transition in many ways is shaping up to be a lot like Donald Trump's first transition in his first term, where you had shouting matches and leaks and warring factions and different people who were up and then down, which frankly is just the way the president-elect likes to have it in certain ways. And we write about a number of people and a number of moments, but one person our reporting who came up repeatedly was, as you said, Boris Epshteyn. He is Trump's lawyer, a good friend of Trump's son, Eric. They went to college together, and he's in the mix and rubs a lot of people the wrong way. We reported, for instance, that there was a meeting, a transition meeting that he was not welcome at. It didn't have to do with the legal nominees, but when he was told not to join by the transition chair, Howard Lutnick, he sort of used his forearm to brush him aside and enter the room anyhow. To be clear, this isn't sort of the ultimate fighting matches that Donald Trump likes to go to, but it was jarring enough that this anecdote made its way around Mar-a-Lago and then back to me and my colleagues and then to the readers of the Washington Post. Boris and Elon Musk have also clashed a ton. They got in a fight on the Mar-a-Lago patio that was quite visible. Elon Musk has been telling anyone who will listen that he believes Boris is a leaker and that he thinks Boris is having undue sway over cabinet positions, including outside of the legal realm. The last thing I will say, though, someone described it to us as it's Boris against the world. But the reason he has this position is because there's one person who matters. That person is President-elect Trump, and Donald Trump likes Boris. He likes that he is an attack dog, that he's a fixer, that he's a loyalist, that he was part of this effort that just last week got the sentencing of the hush money trial in Manhattan indefinitely postponed. So a number of people may have turned on Boris, but until Trump does, he's going to be in that orbit.
And so, Mark, Axios is calling it the most diverse, ideologically diverse cabinet. Certainly not ethnically or racially diverse. There's one one black person, again, at HUD, which is the same position, of course, that Ben Carson had the last time. So that seems to be, as some critics have said, the black job in the cabinet. But ideologically diverse, it just seems to me that they're all MAGA people. They're all people against the so-called deep state. There is one union-backed person who is the Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez DeRemer from Oregon, who's a defeated Republican congresswoman.
Well, Andrea, I'm not sure that the cabinet picks should be affirmative action picks. I think the reality is
you're not going to have affirmative action, but do you think that it's ideologically diverse? I
do. I would agree with Axis. I think there's several picks that conservatives can celebrate. I think Russ Vought at OMB. I think Doug Burgum at Interior, Chris Wright at Energy, Rubio at Secretary of State. Those are things conservatives can get excited about. But at the same time, Randy Weidgardner got her position at Department of Labor, the person she wanted. I think that Putin and Assad got their pick at DNI. I think the reality is that the pro-masking of children, forced masking of kids, got their pick at Surgeon General. So yeah, I think the reality is it's pretty ideologically diverse.
Although the DNI choice would fit with Donald Trump's embrace of Putin in a lot of respects.
Well, again, Andrea, I mean, I know that is, I think, a part of the media narrative rhetorically, but I do think the first administration was pretty tough on Russia when it came to kicking out the diplomats, when it came to attacking their mercenaries in Syria. I think there were plenty of actions the administration took. Of course, you had pretty strong traditional conservative foreign policy advocates around him and his vice president, his secretary of state, driving that policy.
Well, it may be that the meeting that I covered in Helsinki, for instance, where he accepted Putin's denials, I mean, I think it was driven by his anger over the Russian probes. So
I think it's
anger
exactly
at
right.
the intelligence community.
I think that's exactly right, Andrew.
That's the comment.
And as I said, I think rhetorically there was a lot more favoritism, but I think the policies were different during the first administration.
No, agreed entirely. Peter, Donald Trump is the first president-elect, as I say, not to sign the ethics documents, meaning he can raise unlimited amounts of money for his transition. There were problems before that with his inaugural committee last time around, where money was not accounted for properly. And foreign nationals could even contribute with no accounting. There are a lot of conflict of interest problems as well. Look at Elon Musk. Look at his influence over the choice for the FCC, where he's the only satellite operator that requires FCC approval, and that he's going to be doing the government-wide, co-chairing this with Vivek Ramaswamy, the government-wide budget cutting when he has such large government contracts.
Yeah, it's remarkable if you think about it, to have a private individual who has a great deal of financial interest in the federal government promising to eliminate $2 trillion out of the $6 trillion annual budget. That's what he says he can do. Now, that, to anybody who's been in Washington for a long time, understands that that's very unlikely, to say the least, that we don't even spend $2 trillion on discretionary programs, including NASA and all the other contracts that Elon Musk himself gets. So if you were to actually want to get the federal government down by that, you'd have to go after things like Social Security, Medicare, the Defense Department, Veterans Affairs, other big entitlement programs that have traditionally been, protected. You want to do something painful, that would be required. But you're right, to have a guy who has his own personal interests involved helping to make those decisions, that's pretty remarkable. And look, but President-elect Trump has decided that he doesn't care about Washington's, sensibilities on these kinds of things. He's not signing the ethics rules. He's not putting his own business interests to the side, as at least he said he did when he came in 8 years ago. This time he's not even bothering to talk about that. Remember, his interests are pretty wide in terms of not just in the United States, but across the world. His view, I think, is that he won. And that people trust him, and that he can make his own rules, and he doesn't have to live by the rules of that Washington has created, and in his view are illegitimate.